Good to see everybody. Just an announcement here. Edward Tien wanted me to tell you guys that the maturity team has opened up registration for the revival today, so you guys can actually sign up immediately. And the revival is actually called the I Am Revival, and the pastor will be coming. His name is Pastor Chon. And what I've heard from Edward is instead of t-shirts for this revival, the maturity team is doing something different. They're going to be offering crew neck sweaters. What an incentive, crew neck sweaters. Are they going to be the V-neck sweaters? No, okay, just regular sweaters. All right, so make sure you sign up for the revival. I don't know how they're going to get the print on that, especially if you guys do wool or something, but we're looking forward to seeing that. So as I mentioned to you guys, Pastor Eric is out for the next 2 weeks, and I'm going to be giving a couple messages, and I want to be actually giving some of the messages from the book of Ruth. And we're going to be going through the book of Ruth together. We won't make it through the whole thing, but I'll pick out some certain passages from the book of Ruth. And when most people, when they think about the book of Ruth, they look at and they think about the person and the character of Ruth herself. But I would like to look at the person of Naomi over the next 2 weeks. In fact, I personally believe that I could make a case that this book could have been called the book of Naomi, because Naomi seems to be a very pivotal person in this story. If you look at this next slide here, you can see that the structure of the book of Ruth, you can see that Naomi is actually one of the principal subjects of this story. Naomi is actually the one in the story who has a major problem to overcome. And it's Naomi in this story who's a developing character. And it's Naomi who the women of Bethlehem sing about in their very last act, in the very end of this entire story. And we see the women of Bethlehem sing in chapter 4, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you, Naomi, without a guardian redeemer." So Naomi is a very important character in the book of Ruth. So today, let's look at the person of Naomi. And as we look at Naomi, I'd like for y'all to actually consider this question. I want you to consider this question. What do you do if you are a victim of a broken dream? What do you do if you are a victim of a broken dream? As you know, the American dream is being married with a nice house in the suburbs, having financial security, 2.5 kids, yearly vacations, and a dog named Lucky. And the phrase, the prosperity gospel, has over the years become a negative phrase, because, especially in Protestant churches, because this phrase is associated with God wanting you to have a wealthy life here on earth with the American dream. And some pastors and television evangelists have been exploiting people across the nation for years, aligning the gospel of God with the American dream. Many of you all heard or seen television evangelists who've asked people to actually send in money in the mail in order to receive a prayer cloth in return that has been prayed for by God's favor for the evangelists. Just send in $19.99 and I'm going to send you a prayer cloth, is what they say, so that you'll have God's favor. And as many of you know, you might know this man. His name is, he's the prosperity gospel pastor, Kenneth Copeland, who once said in front of a large audience, "You'll get spiritually rich and you'll get financially rich." Now, because of this messaging from television evangelists and preachers, many conservative Protestant Christians see the prosperity gospel as false. But we all have to admit to ourselves, to some degree, we all want some level of prosperity, including those Protestant Christians who say the prosperity gospel is false. In Psalm 73:3, the psalmist states this, "For I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." And I think we can all actually can relate with this verse in our lives. When we see the wicked in prosperity, it does not sit well with us at all. And there have been times in our lives when we all have envied those people who are living in prosperity, even though they're wicked. You see, to some degree, we all desire prosperity. However, if you are a Christian, what you need to know in the Bible is that the Bible is more focused on something else for you. You see, the Bible is focused on you being blessed, versus you being prosperous. In fact, in the Bible, blessing and prosperity are not entirely equivalent. Yes, prosperity generally refers to a state of success, abundance, economic growth in the Bible, and it often involves material wealth, material stability, title, and position in society and overall well-being. But blessing, on the other hand, in the Bible is a broader term that may or may not include prosperity. Blessing may not include prosperity because blessing can mean thriving in other intangible aspects of life that are spiritual, emotional, and relational well-being. You see, what we really need to understand as Christians is that the Bible preaches a blessing gospel versus a prosperity one. And the reason why we know that the Bible preaches a blessing gospel is because the Lord God, when he called upon the very first Hebrew named Abraham, the Lord proclaimed the gospel of blessing over Abraham. He says this, the Lord said to Abram, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. This passage is actually found in the Old Testament in Genesis chapter 12. But when you get to the New Testament, this man named Abraham is mentioned 74 times, making him the most mentioned Old Testament character in the New Testament. And throughout the New Testament authors are linking followers of Jesus to this guy named Abraham and his blessing. But what's very interesting in the New Testament is that the New Testament authors never mention prosperity as their form of blessing. In fact, they usually warn against pursuing it. The Apostle Paul states in 1 Timothy 6:9, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. On the other hand, the New Testament in fact states that people can be blessed outside of prosperity. Like James 1:12, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. And this is why I find Naomi in today's story in the book of Ruth quite a fascinating person. Because when you read the book of Ruth, what you'll see is that Naomi is a person who becomes blessed but not prosperous. Naomi is a woman who becomes blessed but not prosperous. And on top of that, what I think is amazing about the story of Naomi is that Naomi starts as a victim. She's a victim of a broken dream. And Naomi will help us answer the question, what do you do if you are a victim of a broken dream? So let me read Ruth chapter 1, but keep an eye on Naomi in this passage. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They are Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. One was named Orpah and the other Ruth, and they lived there for about 10 years. But Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of this people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. When Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you've shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, we will go back with you to your people. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. At this they wept aloud. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I'll go, and where you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely. if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And all the people said, okay. Now, Naomi in this story is clearly a victim. She's a victim of a major loss, of not the American dream, but of the Israeli dream. You see, the Israeli dream was for someone like Naomi, was being married with a husband, having children, and then her children getting married, and then they having children, providing her grandchildren. The Israeli dream has to do with genealogy. And here the Israeli dream was a dream of honor, of fruitful genealogy showing a fruitful family versus the shame of showing a barren one. And what we read in this story is that this story starts with the complete crushing of Naomi's dream. And while many people, when they read the story of Ruth, may find Naomi is irrelevant, what we'll see in this story is that Naomi is highly relevant because her circumstances touches the hearts of many people in this room today. In fact, I would venture to guess that all of you in this room have a broken dream of sorts. I have to venture to guess that we all have encountered expectations that were not met. There were times in our lives when we had an image of our future that has not come to fruition. And many of us, like Naomi, it does not seem like it'll ever come to fruition. Whether it be a job or a certain position in a company, the unexpected loss of a loved one of whom you're expecting to be part of your life much, much longer. Perhaps you've endured a broken dream through your children's life situation. Perhaps your marriage has not come to your ideal fruition. Perhaps a loss of a friendship due to moving here to Houston. Or even your Christian dream has been lost. Yes, we have dreams as Christians. Perhaps through your ministry. Perhaps where your kids are spiritually. Or perhaps unsaved loved ones. And the list goes on. You see, very often, we feel like victims of a broken dream. Now, I think it's very helpful to define what a victim is in a given story. In my previous sermons that I gave, and also in Class 401, I mentioned a book by Donald Miller. Miller wrote this book called Building a Story Brand. And Miller said that you can pretty much figure out any movie because all movie lines have the exact same algorithm. All movie lines have a hero who faces a problem and then meets a guide who gives the hero an action plan, and that hero executes the plan, and then the hero ends in success while avoiding failure and becomes a victor. And actually, we can test this theory, right? If you are a Marvel fan and you watched Deadpool and Wolverine, gory movie, by the way, then you can actually slot in the characters. Deadpool is the hero. He faces a problem. The Time Variance Authorities is set to destroy his home universe. He meets a guide, Mr. Paradox. Now, Mr. Paradox is a guide, but he would be considered a bad guy guide versus a good guy guide. Mr. Paradox points him to Wolverine, who's considered a time-anchored being, and tells them how the Time Ripper works. And it's Mr. Paradox information that helps Deadpool and Wolverine come up with an idea for a plan. They execute the plan, and Deadpool ends in success, the saving of his universe while avoiding failure. And Deadpool plus Wolverine become victors. Deadpool and Wolverine, the movie, is a more complex story, but you can see that the basic framework is still there. But one point that is very insightful, one very insightful point from Miller's book was this idea of the victim versus the hero. Miller says this. He says that the weakest character in the story is always the victim. And the second weakest character in the story is the hero, because the hero always has a problem to overcome. Let me say that one more time for you. Miller says that the weakest character in the story is always the victim. But the second weakest character in the story is the hero, because the hero always has a problem to overcome. So the victim, or victims in the story of Deadpool and Wolverine, are Deadpool's friends who might be removed from the universe. And therefore, Deadpool, the hero, is the second weakest character because he has a problem to overcome, the saving of his friends. And if we can actually understand the difference between a victim and a hero, this is going to help you understand the story of Naomi. For Naomi certainly starts as a victim. And Naomi is going to reveal to us how to know if you are in a season of being a victim, the weakest character in your story, and then how to navigate to becoming the hero, the second weakest character in your story, and then transforming you into a victor. In chapter 1 of Ruth, we're going to see 7 observations about Naomi that describe her as a victim. And I placed these 7 observations about Naomi in your notes for you to actually follow along with me. And with these 7 observations, we're going to determine, with Naomi's help, how do you know if you are in a season of being a victim of a broken dream? You see, the first thing that we learn from Naomi is that you and I might be a victim of a broken dream if, number 1, you have recently endured or are currently enduring scarcity due to the sins of other people. You have recently endured or you're currently enduring scarcity due to the sins of other people. We see, starting in verse 1, the text states that Naomi was in an environment of economic famine or environmental scarcity. And verse 1 opens up by stating, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. This phrase, the days when the judges ruled, is not a positive phrase. Because during the day of the judges, the Israelites were no longer thriving due to the worship of other gods and idols. And because Israel's leaders had broken their relationship with God, God would not help the Israelites out until these leaders repented. So, Naomi is forced to experience scarcity. And Naomi's family was forced to leave Moab to find food. In other words, the famine was not her fault. It was not her fault. It was the fault of the Israelite leaders because they had sinned. You know, sometimes in life, we endure scarcity not because we've done something wrong, so now God is punishing us. Sometimes in life, we endure scarcity because we're experiencing the fallout of other people's mistakes. And since we live in a cause and effect world, and because we live in a world of kind of chain reactions, we sometimes are forced to endure pain and suffering because of another person's sin. And I actually often hear stories all the time about college students who have to endure suffering due to the sins and the mistakes of their parents. And I also hear stories from college students who have endured pain and suffering through the sins and the mistakes of their peers. And Naomi had to endure suffering due to the mistakes of the Israelite leaders. Here's a question for you. Are you currently forced to endure major pain and suffering due to another person's sins or mistakes? If so, you might be a victim of a broken dream. Second, you may be in a season of being a victim of a broken dream if, number 2, you've endured the loss of a nurturing, connected community and culture. You're enduring the loss of a nurturing, connected community and culture. The story continues in verse 3. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. One was named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husbands. You know, nurturing relationships are hard to come by, and they're very difficult to replace. And Naomi had lost the most meaningful relationships of her life with the loss of her husband and her 2 sons. Obviously, the death of family members will immediately cause a sense of deep, deep loss. And it's going to affect your family's relational culture depending on which family member has passed away. But a nurturing, connected community can also be lost in many ways other than death. In fact, I met a lot of college students who feel isolated because they don't have a spiritual community. but they're reluctant to commit to involve themselves with church because growing up in middle school or in high school, they had witnessed inappropriate moral failures of their pastors and spiritual leaders. Some of you, actually in this room, might realize that the loss of a nurturing, connected community can simply happen within house church relationships. Lately, I've actually started to feel real bad for our college students and these students who graduate and they move away, or even those students who actually stay. And it's because they built nurturing relationships all throughout these 4 years of college and through house church. And they experienced a culture among their peers that they had really, really enjoyed. But with each graduating year, there's a sense of loss when these people leave. Adult house churches can experience the loss of a connected culture when their house church multiplies. It's that period right before multiplication. It's the most blissful and thriving period. And it's usually when that culture of that house church is at its peak. But when the house church multiplies, there's this reset that has to happen with the culture, with the two new house churches. And this is sometimes a very painful process to rebuild. You see, if there was no need to actually reach out to VIPs, we would never need to multiply. And we would just stay in that connected culture and that we really enjoy. And when you have a thriving house church, nothing is better than the feeling of being in that dream house church situation. In this story, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, they're all victims of a loss of a nurturing, connected community and culture of which they cherished amongst each other when their husbands were with them. And when when her husband and two sons died, she lost that. Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. Are you experiencing the loss of a nurturing, connected community and culture? The third way we learn from Naomi that you might be in a season of being a victim of a broken dream is number 3. You are confused about whether you should advise your children or friends to follow God or follow the world. That shows a broken faith. Showing a broken faith. You're confused about whether you should advise your children or friends to follow God or follow the world. Showing a broken faith. My old manager at my old company, he used to have this expression that he always used when talking to us. He would say, "You're speaking out of both sides of your mouth. You're speaking out of both sides of your mouth." And my manager would have said this to Naomi if he had the opportunity. When Naomi says one thing out of her mouth, she says to both daughter-in-laws in verse 8, Naomi says, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you've shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you find rest in the home of another husband." But then, in verse 15, Naomi says this on the other side of her mouth when talking only to Ruth. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." You see, when Naomi said this to Ruth, this is certainly contradictory. May the Lord bless you versus follow your gods and go back with your sister. Oftentimes in life, we are in a season of being a victim, and sometimes we get confused on whether we should promise the path or we should promote the path of God's promise or promote the path of the world's promise to our children and into the world. But parents and young people, don't forget Psalms 25:10. All the ways of the Lord are loving and faithful toward those who keep the demands of his covenant. All the ways of the Lord are loving and faithful toward those who keep the demands of his covenant. What are the demands of the covenant? Do not have any other gods before me. By the way, in the days when Jesus lived, following the world equated to following gods with a small g. So if you go and you read Ephesians and 1 John, you'll see this. And this is why John says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever." When we are a victim of a broken dream, sometimes we just want to say, I give up. Following the Lord is too hard. And often we tell people, don't follow me as I try to follow the Lord. Find the path of prosperity out in the world for yourself. And when we say things like this, in this sort of way, it reveals our broken faith. It's going to reveal our broken faith. Naomi revealed her broken faith when she told Ruth to follow her sister as her sister follows her gods. Do you find yourself promoting the path of the Lord or the path of the world to your children and to your friends? And this leads me to the fourth way you may realize you are in a season of being a victim of a broken dream. Number 4, you have become a realist, and you've lost all hope that God can invert your situation for good. You have become a realist, and you've lost all hope that God can invert your situation for good. In verse 11, we read, "But Naomi said, 'Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought that there was still hope for me. Even if I thought there was still hope for me. Even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them?'" So Naomi here, she becomes a realist, and she lost all hope that God can enter into her situation and change things for the good. You know, the definition of a broken dream is losing hope. That's the definition. The definition of a broken dream is losing hope. You see, hope means that your dream is alive, but no hope means that your dream is crushed. And sometimes we go through this period in our life when our dreams seem completely crushed, and we can't even muster up any iota of hope. So I have the worst memory. And so last night, I needed my wife's help to help me remember a crushed dream in my life. And she thought for a bit, and she says, "Oh, I have one." And she proceeded to remind me of what happened in the past. So during my college years, I got emotionally turned upside down. You see, I made a huge mistake in college. I became best friends with a person of the opposite sex during my freshman year at UT. I'll call this girl Mary. That's not her real name, but let's just call her Mary. You see, Mary and I became friends through mutual friends. And Mary started calling me on the phone and started leaving me messages at my dorm room almost every day. You see, back then in college, we did not have cell phones like you college students. We had regular landline phones and an answering machine. Remember those days? My generation? And I'd get these messages when I'd return home from class. "Hi, Sang. This is Mary. Call me back." And because she was calling me all the time, I thought she liked me. Well, through our conversations with each other, we started to share really deeply with one another. And I didn't realize that my desires for a relationship with her grew. College students at this time, she met all my scoops and sprinkles. So Mary and I became friends. And I ended up liking this girl the entire time I was in college. But I never told her for 4 years. Emma's like holding her face like, "Oh my gosh." But then what happened was my other best friend, a guy, also started liking her. Although I told him. That's my college students for you. They really feel bad for me all the time. Although I told him that I liked her. Then I found out that he started dating her without telling me. For 4 years, Mary never told me that she liked my guy friend. So I sort of felt betrayed by my best friend Mary and sort of felt betrayed by my best guy friend. Well, they started dating, and ultimately it ruined the relationships with all 3 of us. They didn't work out, and we all married different people, and clearly I won. Clearly. I'm telling you, God is good. God is good. But at the time, if you can imagine, it was a crushed dream. Especially when you desired something for 4 years of your youth. And back then, when they started dating, I lost all hope. I clearly remember. You know, in life, hope is the only thing that keeps us going. But when your hope gets crushed, then so does our spirit. Have you lost hope due to your circumstance? This is what happened to Naomi. And this leads me to number 5. Number 5 is obvious, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but you know you're in a season of being a victim of a broken dream when number 5, the people around you notice the drastic change in your life. The people around you notice the drastic change in your life. Look at what happens to Naomi in verse 19. So the 2 women went until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" The women of Bethlehem are in shock at what happened to her. They say to her, "Can this be Naomi?" By the way, the name Naomi means pleasant in Hebrew. And her friends obviously did not see Naomi as pleasant. And this actually leads me to number 6. You know you're in a season of being a victim of a broken dream in that, like Naomi, you have become bitter and your situation has defined you. Like Naomi, you have become bitter and your situation has defined you. Naomi says this in verse 20, "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Mara in Hebrew means bitter, like when the Israelites were in a place and they couldn't get water, and so they called that place Mara because they were so bitter. You know, often in times, bitterness is equated to anger, but bitterness does not always just mean anger and disappointment. With bitterness, there's always a sense of unfairness and injustice. Here you say to yourself, my situation is wrong. It is unfair and is unjust. In fact, you might find this interesting. Did you all know that there are actually many hyperlinks between the book of Ruth and the book of Job, such as this one? You can actually see here on the screen that there's similarities. When Naomi said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for Shaddai has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full and Yahweh has returned me empty." This compares to Job 27:2. "As the Lord lives, who has taken away my right, and Shaddai, who has made my soul bitter." These hyperlinks around the Hebrew word for bitter are intentional because Naomi is considered by the authors to be in a very similar situation, in a similar emotional place like Job. Has your situation made you bitter? When you are in this situation where you feel bitter, you are certainly a victim of a broken dream. And this actually leads me to the last way we learn from Naomi. How you might be in a season of being a victim of a broken dream is number 7, you blame God. Number 7, you blame God. Just like in the book of Job, Naomi's blame of God crescendos throughout this chapter. She starts in verse 12. "No, my daughters, it's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord has turned his hand against me." Verse 20, "The Almighty made my life very bitter." Verse 21, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Lord Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Now, you and I might not be so vocal when we blame God, but we often can blame God like Naomi within our heads. Have you finally come to a place where you're blaming God in your mind? You know, with a room this size, I'm sure that many of you in this room have experienced or are currently experiencing a season of being a victim. But despite these 7 observations that describe Naomi in chapter 1, what I love and what I find so encouraging about the Bible is that the Bible contains many stories with heroes such as Abraham, Moses, and King David, who are considered to be the second weakest character of their stories. But what I love even more about the Bible is that the Bible contains stories with victims who eventually turn into heroes, and then these heroes eventually turn into victors. For example, like Job. Job becomes a victim of Satan. But then as a victim through his 3 friends, Job transforms into a hero by trying to overcome his problem of defending himself while figuring out why his suffering has come upon him. And then by the end, Job actually turns into a victor. In fact, he ends with faith in God. He ends by forgiving his enemies, his 3 friends who have accused him multiple times. And God restores his fortune by 2x. You see, most movies, they place very little significance on the victim. But in the Bible, It does not matter whether you are the weakest character in your story or the second weakest character in the story, in your story. In both cases, God is the one who has to come to save them both. Do you know who the strongest character in the story is? According to Donald Miller, the strongest character in the story is the guide. The guide. And what the Bible is trying to say to you and me is that in any given period in our life, whether you are either a victim or whether you are a hero, in both places you need God, your guide. And why I find stories like Naomi fascinating is that sometimes in certain seasons and periods in our lives, we see our own story through the lens of the victim. And while this may be true, and while you might be blaming God, the Bible never sees this as your ultimate fate, because for the Bible, this is momentary. This is only a season. In fact, the ray of hope for Naomi is found in verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. You see, according to the Bible, there is always this ray of hope. You know, in conclusion, in 2001, Brian Birdwell was serving on the Department of Army Staff at the Pentagon as a military aide. And on September 11th, he was in the Pentagon when American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the building. It was 9:37 a.m. in the morning, and Birdwell was just leaving the restroom, was standing in front of the elevators when the plane hit, and it slammed him across the hall, and it ripped the glasses off of his face. And he was immediately engulfed in flames, and his whole body was on fire. Birdwell said that the pain came instantly, and the heat was so intense that his polyester pants of his uniform melted into his leg. It melted into his leg. He tried to stand up and leave the building, but the pain was way too intense. So now, Birdwell is a Christian, and in his anguish, he screamed out, "Jesus, I'm coming to see you. I'm coming to see you." And then later in an interview, he said, "I knew I was going to die. As a soldier, I've been trained never to give up, but I gave up. I didn't try to get up again. Instead, I thought, okay, Lord, if this is the end for me, if this is the way I'm going to die, then so be it." But amazingly, Birdwell had been flung across the building under the sprinkler system. And the system turned on, and the fire was actually put out. And somehow he crawled out of the building to safety. But unfortunately, he had suffered severe burns, over 60% of his body. And his recovery was long, involving over 39 surgeries, months of hospitalization, and numerous skin grafts, plus 4 years of rehabilitation. Birdwell was surely a victim. Yet Birdwell made a miraculous recovery. In Birdwell's book called Refined Fire, which is a book which interviews him and his wife, Birdwell talks about learning through his most painful periods. He says, taking care of the burns is as much a psychological care as it is physiological. I was mentally anguished because I was completely dependent on other people to bathe me, to feed me, to help me use the restroom. There was nothing I could do on my own. I even needed a ventilator to help me breathe. And understanding my distress, my wife Mel would pray for me every morning, asking God to give me a good day. I kept trying to look at my struggles and the progress in the light of eternity. I would think, yes, this may be 2 or 3 years of suffering, but in God's view, it's nanoseconds in terms of eternity. So I can get through this. But this was difficult to maintain, this perspective. I could know it, but it was often difficult to live it. When I could live it and think this way, it was tolerable. My pain was tolerable, and I can get through. Well, during the recovery, Birdwell often questioned during this time why God did not take him home. But later, Birdwell would realize that God was working with purpose in him. God was transforming him into a hero. In 2004, he and his wife founded the nonprofit organization, Face the Fire Ministries, which provides support to burn survivors and wounded servicemen and women. Then, in 2010, he was elected to the Texas State Senate and has been reelected by his constituents 5 times, averaging more than 85% of votes cast. Now, if I were to tell you as a victim that there is hope that one day you're going to be elected as a high position official, like the Texas State Senate, what I would be doing is preaching to you the prosperity gospel. But if I were to tell you as a victim of a broken dream that there is hope, that one day you are going to bless other people through your experience of pain, like Birdwell has blessed other people, burnt victims through his ministry, Face the Fire Ministries, I would be preaching to you the blessing gospel. You see, God is always working. God takes victims, the weakest character in his story, and then he turns them into heroes, the second weakest character in his story, in order to carry you forward, the blessing gospel through Jesus Christ. And the hero always has a problem to overcome in God's story, the saving of people's lives. God takes your story of pain and intricately weaves his story on top of yours so that you will have a spiritual genealogy through the saving of people. This is what he does with the person of Naomi. And next week, we're going to talk about the process of how Naomi overcomes her season of being a victim of a broken dream. But what I like to fast forward to is chapter 4. If you look at Ruth 4:13 through 17, it says this. So Boaz took Ruth and became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And listen to this. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son. Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse and the father of David. God promised Abraham blessing, and therefore God will bless. Blessing is about genealogy. You see, the gospel of blessing, God wants to bless your genealogy. Not with physical genealogy necessarily, but with spiritual genealogy, like we see with Naomi. Naomi has a son, but it was Ruth who had the son, but Naomi has a son, right? Do you know what I find incredibly amazing about New Life? God has consistently and repeatedly taken victims of broken dreams here and has turned these members into heroes. And these people are out to save other people. We know that God, the guide, is the only one that saves. But we are the heroes that bring us to God. And God is now blessing them with a spiritual genealogy through them, as promised to Abraham over 4,000 years ago. And you know that these victims turn heroes. They may never be acknowledged on this side of heaven, on this side of eternity. We don't know if they will. But surely on the other side of eternity, God is going to welcome them. And he's going to give them an eternal weight of glory. So what do you do if you are a victim of a broken dream? Don't look towards the prosperity gospel. Look towards the gospel of blessing. This is a promise that has been guaranteed over 4,000 years ago. And the gospel of blessing will transform you to become a hero, to save people's life through the gospel and take people to God. And one day, ultimately, a victor. And when you are on the other side of heaven, and as you look back, you're going to be looking back as spiritual fathers and mothers to many people, even though they might not be of your own physical descent. God has not forgotten about you. He has not forgotten about you. So don't give up. You just have to make room for God to work in your life. Amen? Let's pray.